and Bach's music was lost forever. After a month in prison, Bach headed off to the job he'd been hankering after all along, that of Kapellmeister. He joined a music-loving Prince, Leopold, at the castle in Köthen, not far from Weimar, as his music director. And it was the beginning of a wonderful new phase in his life. 5.5 years of relative trouble-free composition. The first time in his life where he's away from the church. He's in a secular environment because he doesn't have to write church music. Prince Leopold is a Calvinist. There's no requirements of Lutheran church music at his court. Bach is settled with his family, and he has a sympathetic and extremely music-conscious and music-enthusiastic boss. Bach completed the famous Brandenburg concertos at Köthen, as well as a set of solo cello suites, which are today amongst his most popular works. Just as Bach was, for once, happy and settled, tragedy struck. While he was on a trip to Bohemia with the prince, the only time Bach ever left Germany, his wife, Maria Barbara, died unexpectedly and was buried before he returned and could be told of her death. Their marriage seems to have been a happy one, and this sudden bereavement was another crushing blow for Bach. No one knew better than he how terrifyingly unpredictable an assignation with death could be.
Menschenkind. Oh Menschenkind, hör auf geschwind, hör auf geschwind, hör auf. Oh Menschenkind, geschwind, hör auf geschwind, geschwind. Die sind zu lieb. Oh Menschenkind, hör auf geschwind, die sind zu lieben.
A year and a half after his first wife died, Bach married Anna Magdalena, a professional singer at the Köthen court, 16 years his junior. She was to bear him another 13 children, 7 of whom died in infancy. For his new wife, and at her request, Bach gathered together the music of the Anna Magdalena notebooks. Also at Köthen, he began the 48 preludes and fugues of the well-tempered clavier. It's typical of Bach that to test out a new tuning system, he wrote 2 pieces for each key, major and minor.
For me, the driving thing for Bach, I think, must have been this obsessive rigour. I mean, this is someone who, I think, you know, in writing a collection of keyboard works in every key, I think it's not just that that's available to him. I think he couldn't possibly have done it any other way. I think he would have had to have explored every single key and done it again twice.
Bach's inventiveness is proved by a puzzle contained in the music he's showing us in the famous portrait I passed every day as a child. On the face of it, the piece is straightforward enough.
It's incredibly simple. It sounds just almost like a nursery rhyme. But that's the version that we see as he shows it to us in the portrait.
But from his perspective, what do we see?
Well, if you turn the music up the other way around and read it backwards, what you get is this.
In other words, what's in my head and what you see and what you hear are two different things.
Yeah, I think he's got like a secret smile, and he's not quite looking at it, is he? It's like he knows something that we don't. And I love the fact that it took 100 years for people to start working it out.
The clue is in the title. It's a piece not for 3, but for 6 voices.
If you move the reverse version by a bar, you get this incredible 6-part bit of pop music, really. It's so simple, so complex.
Do you subscribe to the view that a lot of his music is numerological, that it is reflecting not simply just his own name, but actually that he, as a starting mechanism, would rule the paper and measure out the number of bars that he was actually going to use? Or is that just baloney?
I think it was a hugely creative structural mechanism for him, but that was an intuition that he had around numbers and the appeal of numbers for him. And I think he had an almost obsessive enjoyment of pattern, which for me is the mark of a scientist as well. Scientists look for and respond to pattern in nature, and when they find it, they try and categorise it and put rules around it, and then they try and break the rules. And that's the fun bit, is playing with the pattern that they find. And I think it's an intuition that he has, not as a mathematician as such, but more broadly as a scientist.
In his own lifetime, Bach was far more famous as a performer than as a composer. He wrote many pieces for the organ, an instrument on which he was renowned as an improviser of genius. He also stretched the boundaries of another instrument he himself performed on, writing a series of solo dance suites for the violin.
They are light years ahead of anything that was written for the solo violin ever before. He just takes the violin to into a different realm, and asks from the violin to do very un-violinistic things, like triple stops, quadruple stops, polyphonic writing, fugues. You know, fugues were written for harpsichords and for organs and for orchestras, but not for one solo violin.
That is storytelling too. It's a story, if you like, about 4 notes, about D, C, B flat and A. But it's also a soliloquy. It's a very dramatic argument in a similar way to Hamlet's To Be or Not to Be, where you've got a voice arguing with itself and listening to the counter-arguments and arguing with the counter-arguments and speaking against the counter, and so on. There's the continual wonder that he brings it about in the way that he does, which seems to me an absolute miracle, a piece of such splendour and wonderfulness that it on its own would convince me that there was a God, if I felt inclined to take that conclusion from it.
Aged 38, Bach was now at the very peak of his powers. But his lifetime's goal, his Endzweck of writing a well-regulated church music to the glory of God, had been on hold for the past 6 years. The opportunities for writing church music to a high standard only came to Bach very, very rarely in his life. It didn't come in Arnstadt, it didn't come in Mühlhausen, it came for a while in Weimar, not at all in Köthen, because in Köthen he was working in a Calvinistic court, and then he had this big break. Suddenly he saw an opportunity to put his life's ambition into effect. In 1723, there was a vacancy in Leipzig, one of the most important cultural centres in Germany and a thriving cosmopolitan city. Cantor of the Thomasschule, one of the oldest and most prestigious choir schools in Europe, founded in 1212. This was a full-on boys' choir, the younger ones singing treble and alto, the older ones tenor and bass, and playing instruments. It was a great opportunity, but there were problems in plenty awaiting him. Besides music, Bach's duties would also include teaching the boys other school subjects, but he drew the line at teaching them Latin. What's more, only a thin party wall would separate the boys' dormitories and classrooms from Bach's own private living quarters. Bach's determination to see his church music project through eventually overcame his reservations. In April 1723, he showed up at the Leipzig City Hall to be interviewed and offered the job.
So despite all his misgivings, Bach decided to throw in his lot and to accept the title of Thomaskantor and director of the city music here in Leipzig. So he signed his contract and he swore fealty on the Holy Bible.
One of the councillors is on record as saying, since the best man couldn't be obtained, mediocre ones would have to be accepted. The truth is that neither party to this contract could have guessed what they were letting themselves in for. In Bach's own words, hindrance and vexation.
From the moment he set foot in Leipzig, Bach found himself caught in the political crossfire between different factions on the city council. Music, since it carried with it an element of cultural prestige, formed a part of those political tensions. On the one hand, on the city council were those loyal to the elector who wanted a modern Kapellmeister, one who could bring real international prestige to the city, and they were Bach's natural allies. But opposed to them were the Estates Party, who wanted a traditional cantor tied into the school system with all its regulations and with all its teaching duties, and that throttled Bach's room for maneuver.
Before these problems boiled to the surface, Bach set to work. It used to be thought that his cantatas, well over 200 of them, and the two great passions, were composed over the whole 27 years he spent in Leipzig. But in the 1950s, an astonishing discovery was made. By a careful examination of the watermarks on the original scores and parts, scholars discovered that the greater part of the cantatas and passions were actually produced in a white-hot frenzy of just 3 years. Now, how he kept up that rhythm, how he managed to sustain that level of intensity and creativity is just beyond belief. Particularly when you consider Bach's living conditions. This is a model of the Thomas School. The original building was torn down in 1902. Here, Bach and his family lived right next to the schoolboys.
There wasn't enough room for all the kids, and they slept two to a bed. And, I mean, there must have been a heck of a lot of background noise. And he had to concentrate to produce these phenomenal pieces and then to supervise their copying out in his own room.
I think so.
But you wonder how he could ever have had any sort of private life in this sort of outfit. I mean, the conditions being so cramped and the noise and the descriptions of mice and rats running up and down the staircases as well.
Yeah, they probably had a different concept of private life back then.
Must have done.
Bach didn't just have to write 25 minutes of new music each week. He also had to get it copied into individual parts for the musicians to sing and play from. His already cramped lodgings now had to accommodate not just his large family, but also cousins and live-in apprentices to help with the never-ending copying out. In the pressure cooker atmosphere of the Thomasschule and this devastating pace that Bach had set himself, things started to go wrong. If you look at this, you'll see there's a frenzy in the writing. It's almost as though he hardly has time to actually put the beams of the semiquavers and demi-semiquavers into the page. They look like bamboos in a hurricane. And here's something interesting, because this is Kuhnau, one of his favorite copyists. And Bach, leaning over to see what Kuhnau's copied, notices that his name has been misspelt, B-A-C-C-H. He gives him a hell of a cuff across the earlobe, and the ink flies across the page. And here's another example. A cousin, Johann Heinrich, came to Leipzig, and Bach put him to work immediately in the sweatshop of copying. He's made a complete hash of it. He's written out the chorale in the wrong clef and mistransposed it. So he has to cross it all out, and Bach himself has to leap in and write out the chorale neatly at the end. I mean, what a plonker. Here you can see Bach painstakingly trying to repair the damage against the clock to make sure that there weren't terrible errors on the music stands when it came to the one and only rehearsal before the cantata was performed. Bach had constantly to adjust his music to the talents and skills of his available musicians. But also, he had to lure in university students in exchange for private music lessons. There's something about Bach's orthography, his handwriting, which suggests already the gesture, the direction of a phrase. In some cases, Bach was forced to pay for extra musicians from his supplementary earnings, made from playing at weddings and funerals. At the end of each frantic week, Bach unveiled his latest cantata. What the Leipzig congregation made of these towering works, frustratingly, we simply don't know. All we do know is that plenty of people would have heard them. Leipzig was known as the city of churches. It's been estimated that on a normal Sunday, of a population of 30,000, 9,000 parishioners and members of society were crammed into these two churches, the Thomaskirche, the Nikolaikirche, and bulging from the seams of the other churches in the town. Thus, every week, Bach had an audience 10 or a dozen times bigger than in any opera house. Unfortunately, people at the main churches tended to behave as if they were in an opera house, much to the fury of the clergy.
The preachers very often think they don't listen carefully to the sermons, that's for sure. You get all kinds of complaints about people flirting in church, people sleeping in church, people throwing paper airplanes in church, yes, and taking snuff in church.
And
all
dogs
kinds
coming
of
into the
dogs
church.
Coming into church, absolutely. And some churches employ special dog whippers to try to get the dogs out. But and I mean, earlier on you've had complaints about people taking pigs through church because it's the quickest way from where the pig was to market and so on. So I think our sense of proper behaviour within a church is different. So there must have been a huge amount of noise, and one of the problems, that's one of the few things we really do know, is that people drifted in and out before the sermon, after the sermon, during the music. It must have